Good morning, everyone. You're listening to Trace Elements Radio, live today on Tuesday, March the 1st. Happy March, we made it. I'm shocked. So, got a lot of news for you. Kind of wondering how I start this mess. Well, the first thing, and I think you're going to laugh, I was invited on the show. Someone enjoyed my passion from Thursday, and most of you guys enjoyed my tyrannical rant. You guys are freaks, and you know I love you for it, each and every one of you. So, this guy goes, Christianity is now under attack. So after a big sigh, said, what if I told you that native ceremonies were considered crimes, punishable by imprisonment, until the Indian Religious Freedom Act passed in, guess when? 78. Long story short, I won't be on that show. You're probably not surprised. Yeah, I don't think that one would have gone over well. We have some unprecedented historic events going on right now. I realize that when I tell you things, it sounds like it's just the bad news. So let me tell you about a good thing. March 11th, 12th, 13th, 3.5 million people will be in New Delhi for one of the largest synchronized meditations in history. Over 10 million people from around the world have already registered to take place and part in the meditation. So if the earth is our mother, India may be her heart. Their goal is to have 100 million people sending their love into her heart at noon in each time zone, like a wave of life-giving energy. Think if the planet ever needed that, now would be really, really a good time. Because we need to pause for a moment. We have a major carbon monoxide explosion on the West Coast. And at this point, looks like the earthquake, the big one, could happen any day now. I have a lot of information on that. I've talked about it before, and even the satellite info is looking like it's close. In the region, going from British Columbia through Washington, Oregon, and over most of California, readings ramping from 5,000 parts per billion over mountains of the southwestern Canada, as high as 40,000 parts per billion over Southern California. The unprecedented activity again. Cascadia subduction zone, the San Andreas fault. These things that are happening, not just the ones foretold, of course, but it's escalating. And the Peruvian government on Sunday declared an emergency in 16 communities, a huge district in the Amazon is under attack due to environmental damage caused by the oil spill from North Peruvian pipeline. Two great rivers and unknown amount of aquifers because they're lying and won't tell us, leaking. Horrific. Now, of course, Peru is not new to pollution. The Amazon, who is our breath, our lungs, is failing right now. I read your report a couple months ago saying that the Amazon was no longer able to be our breath, to clean this up. We have Zika, who has suddenly just exploded, and the first sexually transmitted case of the disease in Europe has just happened. France, by the way. And the woman hadn't traveled. Her partner did. So we're talking about a secondary. This is jumping. This is a big deal. And a lot of it has to do with the lack of respect here on this planet. You know, I have talked about capitalism and oppression. We have events of those kinds happening in numbers that I don't think there's ever been this amount of darkness on this planet. Let's talk about the native people again, and I will try not to swear, but I want to. This is the only time in human history that a people have been forced onto concentration camps in this way. This isn't just for a couple years. This is multi-generational. They had their languages taken. They were not allowed to practice their religions for over 100 years. They are carded. People on this continent, North America, that are the first peoples, that are the ones that belong here, have to register, and are registered at birth, to prove they're native. As a matter of fact, Hitler got the idea for mass incarceration and internment camps from this continent, from what's happening here. And it hasn't stopped. Know that it hasn't stopped. So when I read your reports of what's going on in northern Canada, and happening, of course, all throughout the United States, we are seeing the devastation of a people. And if you thought that wasn't going to happen to you because you're not brown enough, what do you think the European Union is? Seriously, give that idea some thought and let it sink in. Because every country that is signed up is no longer truly a country, no longer individual. They are part of a thing, a one world order. Not coming. They're slow, they're patient, they have worked on this. It started in Europe, it spread throughout the planet, but they did it first to you guys, again. We have to remember that the West owes its wealth to slavery and genocide. Most of the wealth on this planet has been brought by those two things hand in hand. It was slavery that funded the Industrial Revolution, not in some abstract, ethereal way, but quite literally. right from the famous Watt engine, the first steam engine, was funded from money from West Indian sugar plantations. Many of Europe's fortunes owe themselves to slavery. The facts revealed have been intentionally ignored ever since, because we have a tendency to romanticize history. We go back to some works that were done on this. Williams, for instance, was a classical work, both Marxist analysts and Black history. Actually, Marx himself noted the role of slavery in fueling the rise of capitalism, and he was not wrong. Williams focused his work on the relationship between British capitalism and slavery. But he also deals with the role of slavery played funding the rise of France and the U.S. And would not have happened, Israel would not have happened as we know it without those things. When you chart the economic history of slavery, fueling the expansion of commercial capitalism, leading to the rise of industrial capitalism, you can argue slavery was abolished in England, but not purely for moral reasons, of course, cited at the time, but simply as part of the triumph of free trade over going full pirate, I guess. Abolished, but kind of just outsourced to Latin America, United States. Slave-grown cotton would fuel the Industrial Revolution, the 19th century, as profits from slave-grown sugar had fueled the 18th century. And this is not over. People who are making our cheap $5 t-shirts in Indonesia, a lot of the islands, India, China, are being worked to death for pennies, and they use armed forces to make them stay at work. They put anti-suicide shields so people won't kill themselves in China for this. Now, anti-slavery had become a cover for British imperialism as it expanded in India, and would serve as an excuse for the conquest of Africa. Actually, I've been reading this little book called Negroes, Comrades of the Crown, which deals with the great use of England and what it made during slavery against its American rivals, mobilizing slaves to rise up against their masters during 1812, or using black troops, slaves, to defend Canada. It's kind of a masterpiece, really, but let's return to Eric Williams' classic work, which has inspired and been plagiarized by many recent historians. Eric Williams was the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. Capitalism and Slavery begins examining the origins of slavery. When we look at what's happened on this continent, there would be no America if it wasn't for the 5 million dead slaves that made it to this continent. That's not counting the ones who died on their way over. That's not counting the 100 million natives who died from this. And surprisingly enough, my melanin recessive brothers and sisters, they don't even count the white slaves. They don't even count you. I guess the whitewashing of our history just kind of painted you out of what happened in Europe and here. And Europe, by the way, where this is still happening, there are still a lot of kids missing because, well, North Africa likes your boys, specifically. It looks like the North Africans are stealing your people. As for the 130,000 children missing from the expansion that's going on in Europe right now, those numbers are light. I can't get those numbers, how many are really missing. To question where those kids are being taken, why it's only men being allowed in certain places. I don't know why they hate the Germans so much, but Germany always seems to be the place, we're going to start some shit, let's go to Germany. I don't know why. Well, probably has a lot to do with the strength of the German people and how a couple times they have been strong enough to say, no, we're not fighting. We're not doing it. And they've been raped repeatedly for that. The history that we get in schools that have totally left white people out of what happened to them, how they were dragged here. Now I realize a lot of the newer people that came to this continent, yes, wanted freedom. Why do you have to go and look for freedom? Because home sucks. So let's not romanticize what was going on over there. They were starving you to death repeatedly. But it didn't get much better when you got here. Not for a long time. And the anger that people are experiencing, that are native, that are the first people, is not going to go away because it hasn't stopped. And you could say to me, a lot of what's happening to natives now are from other natives. Unfortunately, this is true too. Not a lot. It's always the guys with the money. But when you look at Lakota, they just killed a woman execution style, but it was the Lakota police that did it. That happens. I'm not glossing over anything here. Unfortunately, you give our men a little bit of money. Our men, all over the world. And if you have a chance to take care of your family, you can go full asshole mode in a minute. Girls too. I know that. Now, when the slavery first started here, the natives died very quickly. Don't do well. Ironically, next, the whites were forced into servitude in a detail especially relevant today. And the rise of mass incarceration state, as Glenn Ford calls it, was the way that the legal system used to force whites into servitude for a variety of petty crimes. This is when it wasn't indentured servitude. This is how they got you when you were here already. And this is the way it's always worked. So at that point, you were given a choice between deportation, servitude, or hanging. In addition, the English poor mounted violent resistances against the spirits, as they called them, those who kidnapped people into servitude. Anyone they suspected could be easily killed by an angry mob. In the colonies, it was much easier for a white in servitude to run away and pass for free, for obvious reasons, until they looked at their arms, because they were branded with the T, but that was a couple generations before. So there's a very vivid picture here of terrible conditions faced by those in servitude, who were also packed into ships that were not meant for people, only slighter conditions of the black slaves. But I have to remind my listeners that it was perfectly legal for masters to beat their white slaves in England, all over Europe, and all the colonies. Then Africa became a new source for forced labor, slavery. I should explain there are two types of colonies. First, those with poor soils and little resources like northern U.S., Canada. Ironically, this would later be to their advantage as they were forced to become diversified, self-sufficient economies. When you're ignored, you do better. The second type of colony, rich soils, natural resources, could be used for quick and easy profits, producing one single crop. This is happening all over the world right now as we speak. This is why there's so much problem in West Africa, in the Congo, because they have something called Coltrane. Not the great jazz musician, but the thing powering our iPhones and our iPads and our computers. But in the 17th century, 18th century, one of the extremely valuable crops, of course, sugar cane. Sugar was the oil of the day. With the introduction of tea and black coffee, bringing that back to Europe, ever demand for sugar. Most efficient way to cultivate it was large plantations. Since it was valuable, it was cheaper to import food with the profits, so much of the land as possible could be dedicated to just this one crop. This is what we're doing right now. This is what's screwing the planet, basically. A lot of pigs, a lot of cows, a lot of corn. Well, there's basically 4 main crops on the planet right now, but the raping of agriculture, our land, putting our animals in these never-ending feeding troughs, where some of them don't move, ever. Working people to death is the same thing as what happened in Jamaica and Haiti and Cuba and Barbados. Sugarcane exhausted the soil, just like what we're doing now. But it was an important factor for the future. The British West Indies, far more valuable than the mainland in amount of profits generated. British West Indies were at one point 4 times as valuable as all the other British colonies combined. The growth of this still colonial future, well, the future northern U.S. states, was fueled by providing food, and supplies for these islands, which generated enormous fortunes. Plantation owners got rich in the sugar, returned to England, where they formed the powerful West Indian interest. It brought a number of famous English politicians like Gladstone and the famous conservative Burke. They used their political muscle to enforce monopoly, sugar, forcing England to buy its expensive West Indian sugar instead of cheaper sugar from France. Well, France's newer and hence more fertile Caribbean colonies. This would later be their downfall, but for a time they would rule England, and their enormous fortunes would fund the industrialization of England. This is how it goes. Slave ships, then cotton, and of course everyone got into it, because they supplied not just the English colonies with slaves, but French and Spanish competitors as well. It was well known at the time. And once, when visiting, an intoxicated actor was being heckled, he shouted back that he refused to be insulted in a town built entirely on the blood of slaves. From its humble beginnings, with a single slave ship sailing 1809 1709. By 1795, Liverpool controlled 5/8 of the British slave trade, 3/7 of the whole European slave trade. Bristol had begun as a dominant slave trading city, forced by Liverpool's competition into equally slavery-related sugar. The growth of Manchester, driven by cotton, manufacturing cotton supplied by slave labor in America's South. Birmingham sold guns that traded for slaves, Africans. One gun, one slave, basically, fueling the massive but forgotten slave-catching wars that would destabilize much of the continent, spreading chaos, horror, murder across Africa. Incidentally, as Gerald Home points out, once Britain abolished slave trade, 1807, the United States took over. Brazil, for example, owes its massive black population to the energetic efforts of the American slave traders. In addition to fueling the growth of some of Britain's most important cities, William points out that many sectors of the English economy, whose growth was fueled by profits of slavery and the slave trade. The growth of iron in the iron industry was fueled by demands for chains and swords and guns used in the slave trade specifically. Slavery financed the growth of commercial insurance industry, a vital element in the growth of capitalism, owing for the management of risk. The slave trade was a risky business, with the constant threat of shipwreck, disease, and of course uprisings. Each slave, a valuable piece of merchandise, was insured for the voyage. The banking industry also owed its growth to massive profits generated by slavery. In fact, many bankers began as slave traders. Captain on a slave ship was the first step on the ladder that led ultimately to the merchant banker. A famous bank that made its fortune off of slavery is Barclays, for example. The rich West Indies and the planters often became bankers on their return to England. Actually, they were so rich that even the king was annoyed and envious of their opulence, and they quickly married into the highest ranks of nobility. So they bought their way in. Now, of course, even the merchants of Europe got rich off the slave trade. In fact, one major reason for the glorious revolution, as William points out, was to destroy the lucrative royal monopoly on the slave trade and open the doors to free trade in slaves, which would fuel England's economic growth in the 18th century. England and France fought wars over the right to sell slaves to Spain's colonies. So, to return to industries fueled by slavery and slave trade, there was shipping. Slavery contributed to a huge growth in shipbuilding, paid for the construction of ports, docks. In Liverpool, Bristol, other cities, of course, textile manufacturing, fueled by the need to provide clothes for millions of slaves. Wool, for example, used to clothe slaves, even though it was completely inappropriate for the tropics. Raw materials for cotton came from slavery, and finished goods traded in Africa for more slaves, of course. The dye industry developed to provide colorful patterns to trade for slaves. There was a whole industry that produced useless trinkets to trade for slaves. That's all they did, just made baubles. The iron industry itself produced bars of iron, which were used as currency on the coast to pay for slaves. The wealthy West Indian interest funded the invention of the steam engine. They also invested heavily in building England's roadways. The Industrial Revolution only happened, it was only fueled, it was only funded by slavery. Cotton would drive the massive growth of industry in the 19th century England. Cotton mills were the biggest factories in England. Their raw material grown by slaves in the U.S., South, of course, Latin America, and supposedly the free semi-slave labor of the Indian Empire. Even England's great philanthropists had been completely enriched by the slave trade. Churches were involved. In America, slave traders would found famous universities like Brown. Some of the most powerful politicians in England were in the West Indian interest pockets. Slavery perfectly respectable. As William points out, it was only changing economic circumstances that forced a change in attitude. And that is all. Although there were important geopolitical reasons as well. For example, the victory of the Haitian Revolution, the inability of the British to conquer the island, where they suffered disastrous defeats at the hands of former slaves, who were masters of guerrilla and conventional war, beat the British, the Spanish, and the French. So the abolition of slavery, of course, efforts of reformers who were backed by powerful new economic interests, bent on destroying the West Indian sugar monopoly, had nothing to do with freeing the people. They wanted cheaper food so they could pay their workers less, and so wanted to institute free trade in food. England had become the most powerful economy in the world. It was cheaper to rely on slave labor in the U.S. and Latin America, as well as cheap labor in India. Free markets became the key to English economic dominance, and the West Indian interest were standing in the way. The abolitionists were tools of the East Indian interest. These were the economic motives behind the Free the Slave movement. Of course, the system of slavery was a nightmare. Barbarous cruelty. Horrific injustice. The horrors of slavery were 100 different forms of torture, grisly murder, becoming part of everyday slang. Thus it was easy to whip up a massive public relations campaign. Powerful mass movement against slavery began to build up. Now I can go on and on about this. But long story short, the wealth of all Western powers, France, America, Great Britain, based on slavery and genocide. Today, this same process continues. Ironically, as the UN revealed recently, slavery is on the rise worldwide. And whether you call it slavery or not, people working in the textile industry, fashion industry, if you can't leave work for 18 hours, is that not slavery? The end of the Civil War in the United States, they put an important loophole. Prison labor. Massively growing sector of America. Maybe the backbone of American economy right now. And just as great of fortunes of the 18th and 19th century are tied to today's slavery. Multinational corporations deeply invested in the growth of mass incarceration. Of course, it would take a whole new article to describe companies involved in big names like McDonald's, Goldman Sachs. Slavery has not ended, as they've told us in school. Slavery is on the rise. Latin America workers in the U.S. are new major victims. There is no crime that capitalism will not commit if it creates new percentage profits. Until capitalism is abolished, the world will never know the end to war, the end to slavery, genocide, imperialism, exploitation, and poverty. I don't know when the Ferengi takeover actually happened. I don't know. But it is here. And Canada is a really big part of it. When I've talked to you about the results, the risk of avoidable death for First Nations, when it was featured again by a plea by Ontario First Nations that Canadians deal with the fact that there is inadequate health care for Aboriginal peoples. It's been noted that tuberculosis rates are 5 times the general population, 50 times the general population for the Inuit. If verifiable, these disastrous figures would show something of an improvement. In 2009, Knights Lantern reported UNICEF's findings that noted tuberculosis rates amongst Canadian Aboriginal people was 90 times the national average. 2013, noted news report said the rate of Inuit tuberculosis was 186 times that of native-born non-Aboriginals. Interesting use of words here. Sources of reliable information concerning the damages to First Nations are and have been intentionally removed, especially by Harper government 2012, when the Conservative government defunded the National Aboriginal Health Organization. But studies linking tuberculosis rates to Canada's poverty levels are also not easy to see. But when you see what has happened here, again, unprecedented in human history, generational concentration camps, because that's what they are. We have to look at that right in the face. People that are so poor. And some of the richest parts of Canada, of course, that they have lost hope, which is the only way you're going to get an 8-year-old thinking suicide is the better option. Now, of course, lack of transparency raises the issues of the government's enduring intentions. Historically, though, disease and healthcare have always been used as a weapon. Northern communities do not have resident doctors. There are so many in Canada, in the north, that go without safe tap water for years. So the rate of sepsis and pneumonia is huge. But this was never going to go well. That's why the United States was never going to go well. That's why Canada was never going to go well. Guatemala, Ethiopia. Everywhere that capitalism has touched does not go well. And of course, our gluttony is not helping. You know, when you have people that will kill each other in line to get a cheap TV, why stop? Really, why stop enslaving people? When we talk about religion, which has been used, which was forced on the people of Europe, because believe it or not, you had your own religions. You had your own beliefs. Christianity was made up to enslave you. Now let's look at that for a minute. And I realize most of us who have seen Christianity up close and personal don't remember when a priest or minister puts their index finger on your forehead and moved it as to record the shape of the cross on your tiny little brow. Yet this moment becomes symbolic, strategic, a freeze frame in a wider context of initiation into the control system that we call society. Some at the end of this receiving end, I guess, of the ritual, have gone on to repeat it with their own children, holding or passing to the priest the little bundle of innocence, so that the mark of the cross could be painted on the beautiful expanse between the links of the two temples. But there's one thing one can almost certainly count on: the fact that nobody truly understands what the hell they just did. Those who enter their children into this ritual believe they are being guided by a power, a doctrine, and are happy to offer their offspring into the protection of the church. But just what nature of protection is, very few are even aware, or take the 5 seconds it would take to read about this. How many even comprehend the excuse given for performing this act, which is that we all arrive on this planet marked by evil? Of course, goes back to the story, Adam and Eve, the serpent and the apple tree, which is really weird since they don't have apple trees in that area, but I will not fight over these small details. So, if it's stated, and it is, in the documents of the Catholic Church, and it applies equally to the Protestant faith, so if you're Christian, it works for you. As a matter of fact, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, pretty much all the big ones, they do this thing. They do the same thing. But what's happening is that one enters life on earth as a sinner. This is their thing. Still bearing the load of some ancestral line of connection to the fall in the Garden of Eden. The baptism ceremony, in or by water, supposedly washes the infant clean of this sin, places him or her under the protection of Jesus or whatever guy is your guy, and the church, the synagogue, or the temple. The Catechism, paragraph. In 1237, we learn, since baptism signifies liberation from sin, and from its instigator, the devil. It's really weird, okay, it's not written in there, I'm saying this part. It's really weird that the devil is blamed for a lot of things, and it looks like humans are doing it. But I digress. One or more exorcisms are pronounced over the candidate. The celebrant then anoints him with the oil of the catechumens, or lays his hand on him, and he explicitly renounces Satan. Thus prepared, he is able to confess the faith of the Church, to which he will be entrusted by baptism. So let's summarize this again. The newborn infant arriving or re-arriving on earth is not greeted as pure or in any way innocent, but is bearing a stain of a sin, the original one apparently. In order to be cleansed, the infant is required to undergo an exorcism performed by a priest. This is what it is. The baptism is an exorcism. Look it up. So I emphasize this simply to remind us the potential huge significance this ritual plays on the unfolding life of the being upon whom it was performed. Accepting that you or anyone is a sinner, once one is old enough to even comprehend the meaning of this word, is truly tragic. It is a horrific way to start life on earth. Tragic for its fundamental representation of their lives. It places the individual into question, into a world where guilt and shame are established as the foundation on which life is built. I walked into an Anglican church, obviously not recently, and I heard the vicar say, "Repeat after me, I am poor and a miserable sinner." And then you saw everyone mouthing these words. Whole congregation doing the same. Their faces carrying a fixed expression of sadness, obedience. I refuse to repeat these words. From that moment on, I knew that I was on my own greater path. I think I was about 7 at the time, I'm not sure. And I would never look back. It was a sober yet liberating moment when I realized that the adults in charge of my life were completely enslaved, owned and bought, that they had no power. Because that's what it teaches your children, that you have no power, that you've given yourself up to a thing. And no one should be subject to a doctrine of superimposed fear and guilt, nor have faith in any institution that attempts to pronounce its will or the word of God. We go back to the Catholic Church. It goes on to tell us, again, in 1250, born with a fallen human nature, tainted by original sin, children also have a need of new birth in baptism to be freed from the power of darkness and brought into the realm of the freedom of God. The Church and the parents would deny the child the priceless grace of becoming a child of God, were they not to confer baptism shortly after birth. Thus, we understand that the power to confer godliness on a newborn infant rests entirely on a man in a dress who, left alone, may rape that child. But a man-made ritual performed by man, done in an institution known as a church, which claims to represent the will of God itself. I know people who have been brought up devout Christians, Catholics, who sometimes, or at one point in their life, find themselves blocked energetically, spiritually. Life experience led to explore other avenues of spiritual growth, which did not confirm a specific doctrine. We'll be back to this. You're listening to Trace Elements Radio.
You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Welcome back, everyone. You're listening to Trace Elements Radio, and we are live on Studio A, Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, and, of course, Trace Elements Radio, and whoever else is carrying me today, thank you very much. So, yes, I was a renegade at 7, but there is a rule. Sunday, you're going to church. I don't care which one, pick one. Mostly because Dad wanted me to hear. I remember listening. I think it was a Catholic priest at this point, reading some passages from the Bible, and when I really got, what do you mean, Jesus is Jewish? Well, no, he's not. I said, because it sounds like he was a Jew. Well, no, he's not. I said, but you just said that his parents were. Okay, so we'll let that go too. And the whole aspect of the fallen. People quote Enoch to tell me about the fallen nature. But it's really weird. And we'll have to go through Enoch. I've been working up to Enoch because Enoch is heavy. What are the things that is most argued about is when Noah's parents see the child. The child was not onto them. He had light skin. He had eyes like the sky. So he's blue-eyed, light-skinned child. They were terrified, to be honest, because they were dark-skinned. So the father of Noah, I forget his name right now, goes to Enoch, who is still actually directly communicating with God, which is something we got to hold in our mind. I mean, talking to him. Noah's father knew he couldn't talk to God, but Enoch could speak to him, have him answer. So they asked, what is this child? Is this one of the fallen? Enoch comes back with a message from God and said, no, this is not one of the fallen. This is a child of man. This is your child, don't kill him, basically. God said the child's righteous. So what do we know from the history, genetic history that we've studied together? There were no blue eyes on this planet before 8,000 years ago tops. It's looking more like 6,000 years ago. Light-skinned, the fairer skin, did not happen anywhere, but it seemed to happen everywhere at the same time. Around 6,000 years ago tops. Which totally blows everything out of the water. You know, I've told you before that I think these stories are about Herne the Hunter, who was actually a guy who lived somewhere around Germany. Maybe not exactly. But it kind of gives us a question, which we will go into in the weeks ahead. Was the Garden of Eden in Europe? These new beings, were they in Europe? Are we looking at a specific history of a specific people who have nothing to do with Africa? Or Kemet? Kemet, which means the place of the blacks, basically, has to do with another history. A specific history to a specific people. We'll go into that at another time. It's interesting, and of course I wasn't there, so I don't know. But that was another thing that bothered me as a kid. Why did God stop talking to us? Why could we suddenly not look at him? Did he become ugly? Actually, some of the tales say that this thing changed so much that it became horrific and you would die if you looked at him. And that some of the stories of, the god with the serpents on his head that would turn you to stone if you looked at him, that this thing became a monster. Anyway, I've questioned these things, especially about the baptism, which actually it's exorcism-y to me. But we have to look at it. So, I went to a priest some time ago and asked about it, because this has been bothering me. He said that there's a seal on the soul that cannot be removed. That particular statement reverberated jarringly. It still does around my entire being. It is such a sickening sense of finality. How could any institution have achieved such incredible powers of judgment over humanity. What is this invention called religion that claims the authority to decide irrevocably and to impose the will of another, in this case, her and the hunter, or the two-faced god, or I'm a little bit looking at towards Odin. Anyway, what kind of arrogance has been unleashed upon humanity by those who teach and uphold such doctrines? Under the subheading, the necessity of baptism, the official wording goes on to state, again, para 1257, the Lord himself affirms that baptism is necessary for salvation. The Church does not know of any means other than baptism that assures entry into the eternal beatitude. God has bound salvation to the sacrament of baptism, but he himself is not bound by his sacraments, which is pretty sensible of him, I would say. So, as if knowing it's gone too far, the soft pedal is then applied. Every man who is ignorant of the gospel of the Church, or of Christ and his Church, but seeks the truth and does the will of God in accordance with its understanding of it, will be saved. Many, many millions or more, over hundreds of years, have sought refuge in the Church to give guidance, leadership in matters of spiritual nature. I, too, have enjoyed the parables of Jesus Christ, gained some sustenance, I guess, a sense of mystery that can still be found in certain churches and whose subtle energies rise above the standard teachings performed by vicars and priests and bishops and archbishops. And I love the glass. But this may be because many churches are built on ley lines over ancient places where they have really strong subterranean energies, and they intersect. Energies known to the older communities that preceded the takeover by all the Judeo-Christian doctrines, but in the process of replacing paganism, which is not a very nice word for it, but the old religion, the Church drew elements from that which is replacing, felt a strong need to exert a tight sense of control over its initiated ones, neophytes, to impose a dogma which to give itself weight, authority, supposedly direct from God, or Jesus, or, one of those guys. But it's here for me where everything starts to unravel. Now, para 1269 says, having become a member of the Church, a person baptized belongs no longer to himself, but to him who died and rose for us. From now on, he's called to be subject to others, to serve them in communion of the Church, to obey and submit to the Church's leader, holding them in respect and affection. So, this doctrine still enslaving many of our people on the planet is the crux of the deception laid bare. Only those suffering a manifest lack of self-belief and high levels of naivete would willingly place themselves under an unquestionable authority of someone else, regardless of spiritual authority. those claim to be in possession of. Those who do obey and submit quickly lose their ability to resist any kind, any form of authority of these figureheads, be they school or clinic or government or military or corporate. They have become slaves to the top-down pyramid of exploitation that holds the world ransom at this moment, which is devastating our planet. And by claiming authority in the name of God, Dog, Anu, the church plays a role in the formation of a doctrine of power, a power imperative, which thrives on the unquestioning acceptance of its dark and deeply misguided agenda, misguided for us, but an incredibly well-played plan for them. Being wedded to Jesus and no longer to yourself might have some consolation within the terms of a spiritual practice, I guess. However, the Jesus adopted by the church has been stripped of the revolutionary elements of the teachings that shook the foundations of the stone of that epoch. Teachings that challenged status quo, dogmas of the Roman Empire, dogmas of the Jewish faith. Now look at this commentary. In one of the Gnostic Gospels, the Nag Hammadi says Orthodox Jews and Christians insist that a chasm separates humanity from its creator. God is holy, other. Actually, when you look at the original words for that, it looks like they're saying God is an alien, which I'm a little bit leading towards. But some of the Gnostics who wrote the Gospels contradicts this too. Self-knowledge is the knowledge of God. Self and the divine are identical. Second, the living Jesus of these texts speaks of illusion and enlightenment, not of sin and repentance, like the Jesus of the New Testament, written not so long ago. Instead of coming to save us from anything even close to sin, he comes to guide, who opens access to spiritual understanding. Jesus no longer serves as a spiritual matter or master once a disciple attains enlightenment. But the two have become equal, even identical. So it's clear to me that a deeply unifying wisdom is possessed by people in the know. But now, the enslavement of our planet by every single thing that's in control is the only Satan that I have ever seen. It is dark. It is not sacred. Sacred, which just means blood, by the way. Certain rituals, membership, worship, participated in by ordained leaders, have been exposed as blatant acts of child molestation, pedophilia, various other forms of sexual and spiritual exploitation, acts that cannot fall. You can't fail to expose the fundamental, deceiving, lying at this root of all this form of mass indoctrination. Do these people think they will somehow be immune to the crimes against humanity? Maybe they do. Catechism, para 1272 states, baptism seals the Christian, seals, with the spiritual mark of his belonging to Christ. No sin can erase this mark, even if the sin prevents baptism from bearing any fruit of salvation. So, of course, in the greater order of things, there's no deviation from truth that cannot be ultimately atoned for. However, this tradition does not embrace Eastern traditions of karma, reincarnation. Well, anymore. There was a book of reincarnation in the Bible, in the Pentateuch. But, that had to be removed. It says some stuff that would be uncomfortable. But anyway, a route by which souls could be purged of repercussions of dark deeds over multiple returns to a third density existence, subsequent working out of stuff which blighted the path before. So what is on offer here is actually perversely materialistic interpretation of the kingdom of heaven. These glittering ranks, the highest of which are heavy in gold embroidery and medals of faith, because you would need a medal. It's just symptomatic of the vast wealth that the church hoards from slavery of your mind, your body, and your soul, which they've done. In the end, the entire package resembles a vast leviathan of energy, stagnant, unmoving mass, lacking the courage to break its own trains of illusion. Ultimately, the unholy mass which inhabits mankind from taking control of its own destiny, provoking instead something pacifist, subconscious obedience. It is a perfect tool for our Ferengi indoctrination. It says everything is ours. Kind of sounds like the demonic one too, that says do what thou wilt. Consume. So, para 1277. Baptism is birth into the new life of Christ. In accordance to the Lord's will, it is necessary for salvation, as the church is itself, which we enter by baptism. Baptism, in accordance to the Lord's will, a seal on the soul that cannot be removed, an RID chip placed under the skin of a newborn. Are these really great advances on the highway of human emancipation? Or a deeply deceptive tool for prolonging humanity's enslavement? Now, the Catechism quotations that I've told you are from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, Vatican Archive. Because if you want to be precise about the enslavement, you got to go there, because they started it. What is happening to our planet right now, physically, mentally, emotionally? The other night I realized the names of the 44 presidents. Tells us a story. I've been consumed lately on what's going on here on planet Earth. Watching our enslavement, watching people totally friggin' miss it. Saying, we don't know what's happened to our country. What happened to your country was it was never yours. And that the free people who were here first live in concentration camps. That's never going to be okay. It won't. But the double tap to my head that's been going on is this is about symbolism. The meanings of names speak louder. And each president does not lay specific claim to their role or the character. We're talking just great big picture here approach to something that extends far beyond the realms of human reason. Reason must not be employed to fully appreciate what lies within or here within. Reason alone cannot explain the intricacies of which we have been enslaved. Earlier, yesterday, 13 bald eagles were found dead in Maryland, Mary's land, the land of Mary, which borders on Virginia. 13 original colonies at birth, symbolized by this bird as we approach death. You know, I would ignore that kind of stuff if it would let me ignore it. Now, 13 has a lot to do with the discovery of immortality. From several stances, the most advanced numerologists truly believe that the numbers 1, 2, and 3 are the most important numbers, since all of the numbers can be formed within them, except 0, which is not a number. The number 13 lacks a 2, or dual component. Thus, it does not perish, nor does it die. It does not have 2 DNA strings. And remember, die, D-I-E, means 2. I believe there's a great deal of knowledge intentionally hidden and goes under this title, The Serpents of Knowledge, in order to ward off unwanted dualistic students of esoteric knowledge. It becomes clear to those who live in duality that they have not penetrated a great deal of knowledge, which is why religion offers very few acceptable answers to true growth, mental, spiritual, and physical. So the answers, the ansar, which means helpers in Arabic, and serpents in the Anu Elish, solutions equals the sun, the soul. Once again, the serpents and the sun are heavily embedded in our language, even more prevalent in ancient languages than English. This didn't just start. It's been going on for a while. So it appears that the number 13 gets the title of being the serpent's number, the number related to the pyramids, the number related to the US dollar bill. It's time for the world to accept that we are sharing our existence with other life forms already. And although most cannot see them, they in fact can see us. Furthermore, it is obvious that there is more than just malicious intent going on here, as David Icke is suggesting, but far more complex, ever unfolding actuality that has been taking place longer than most people have been conscious of themselves. We are what fear is afraid of. We are truth. And it seems to me that something else can be seen here. And personally, I believe humanity may be failing itself. If it doesn't, well, if it's allowing what is in plain sight to cloak itself and elude them, life after life, any hidden mystery to me is nothing more than another puzzle piece. And I must finish to feel complete. There are so many numerous parables and parallels between Israel and the United States. One of the most striking is the number of kings. You can argue that Israel and Judah had 44, if you count them as you do presidents. Grover Cleveland was 22, was the 22nd and the 24th president. For this reason, Obama is the 44th, not the 43rd. After the kingdom split into Israel and Judah, Israel's kings from Jeroboam to Uzziah was 248 years. This puts us into a close time frame for where we are in America's history. This Israel and Judah prior to the Babylonian captivity. As we approach the prophetic hour of the Babylon of Revelation, United States, some would say the Gentile brother of Israel, a type, a shadow, Jehoiakim of Judah ruled 11 years. He was on the throne when Babylon besieged Jerusalem. His name in Hebrew is equivalent to Joachim, the hurricane from 130 days ago. The day the walls were breached, in the Hebrew calendar's exact day gay marriage passed the Supreme Court on 6/26/15. The name means lifted by Yahweh. And you would say Israel, like America, were both lifted by Yahweh, two-head of God. And it appears we are approaching that time period on the planet's history, but definitely echoed by America's history, where once again a great nation comes to a halt. The debt alone could not be paid off with all the wealth that previously exists on all the earth. There are people whose entire life purpose is to destroy this planet. And in the nuclear age, this is conceivable. Let us not overlook the entitled masses who took the opportunity to loot and start a revolution. America is in lockstep with ancient Israel, particularly in how prosperity led to turning from God towards idols. American Idol. The need for spirituality replaced by toys and vanity. The church, again, becoming a gathering place for people to feel better about themselves if they don't pay attention to what they're saying there. A conjoining of self-help and the power of positive thinking under a corporate model of attracting new members. Underlying subtext here to this approach beyond greed is that the gospel needs some charisma laced with ego stroking to get you through. Miraculous works have been displaced by marketing skills of egomaniacs who have been reading Napoleon Hill books, I guess, and attending pastors' conferences more akin to Tony Robbins than anything spiritual. This was Israel. This is Israel, the fundamental human disposition. When God becomes a distant entity whose only purpose is to give you a thumbs up because you fulfilled a requirement, you offered the right sacrifice in the right corner, subjugate yourself, well, your life is anything but a sacrifice. While we are biding our time with the abomination prior to the dissolution of this planet, the United States was not founded by happenstance. It was brought about by men and women who were forced. From the inception, we saw the wheat and the tares grow up together. Considered looting and looters ravaging the innocent, as well as the truly spiritual people, honorable people. This is the case with any group. You have individuals who respect the ways of the earth, and then you have the monsters. It is rare that you will find any large group of people that are all good. In any group, you won't. Some people look at this as a place of fallen men on a pedestal that no man should ever occupy. What has orchestrated the rising and the lowering of all the kings, of all the empires that ever existed? As we approach the setting sun of America's elevated state, I think it'd be helpful to look at the names on the list, on the king's list, of this abundantly, for a while, blessed nation. This is to be the vehicle to spread the gospel to the far reaches of the earth. Assist in returning Israel to a nation state. That's what America did with its buddy England. United States and her people have experienced the widest range of human experiences known to man in its 239 short years. Went from the automobile to the moon, allegedly. Where communication used to take days or weeks by horseback, and now push a button anywhere in the world. But warfare that began with a musket, and now an entire country can be obliterated in an hour with the push of a button. The good, the bad, and the ugly. We live in a world full of darkness. Great evil. But even great evil cannot exist without an equal amount of light. A shining city on a hill has become a campfire top of a mountain of ruins, while Ishtar continues to light the harbor of the harlot. Anyone who is awake understands it is a short matter of time before the lights go out. Throughout this planet, light goes dark. There are many individual lights which will shine on all the brighter until the day dawns. We try not to lose hope as we sense the darkness encroaching. For most of this planet, the darkness has already arrived. For most of this planet, they don't know they're in the dark yet. But it is a unique moment in history, which I think will reverberate for all eternity. We're watching, in a very short period of time, all of the history we've been told laid bare in front of us. And again, the darkest evil that has ever happened on this planet is happening right now. People enslaved for cheap t-shirts, worked to death for fashion. In fashion where women are starving themselves to look emaciated enough. They don't even look human, do they? Someone smarter than me will be needed to see the moment of loss. I go sometime around First World War. It was over. They won. They won. The rich finally won. But of course we could go before that. It's just we don't hear enough of the past to know the truth of it. There were many great beings on this planet. We could see them by what they built that still lives. Were those us? I don't know. I just don't know. But it's important to understand subtleties. Jacob means supplanter. And supplant can mean overthrow, dispossess, usurp, succeed, secede, unseat, undermine. Jacob refers to, grafted in Gentiles as descendants. Each name has specific meanings that are only straightforward when you look at them in context. So here is an example of what we are doing with the presidents. The gospel is hidden in Genesis, Hebrew, and English. Adam, man. Seth, appointed. Enosh, mortal. Kenan, sorrow. Mahaliel, the blessed God. Jared, shall come down. Enoch, teaching. Methuselah, his death shall bring. Lamech, the despairing. Noah, rest, comfort. It might not be straightforward, though you could say all the names have specific meanings. They required a little fleshing out, whereas anointed or teaching are very specific when we look at 2 or 3 names per individual. It becomes less precise. For this reason, I have torn this thing apart. And we can see that some words can mean 1 or 2 things. Both are etymologies of words, but only one of them may apply to the overall message. So the president, George Washington, George, tiller of soil, farmer. From the town of Wesa's people. Wesa, the word Wesa means the hunter, or an hunter. At least suggests, logically, in both cases, the meaning is a hunting lodge, or similar. A lodge. Lodge is usually to do with some sort of Freemason thing. It is a gathering of places. Hunt and farm the land. Farmers and hunters. One cultivates to create, the other destroys for subsistence. Hunters and farmers, both accessible, acceptable, needed, some would say, but in a symbolic sense we see a distinction here. To hunt and take the land, which is what he did. Next, John Adams. John, God is glorious, has shown favor. Adams, man, literally, one formed from the ground. Adama, ground. Bearable to Latin, man, homo. Human, humus, earth, ground, soil. Adam is related to red, the ground, the ruddy. God is glorious and has shown him favor to the man who created out of earth. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas, it's actually Aramaic origin. It means a twin. Jefferson, son of Jeffrey. Jeffrey District, a traveler, a peaceful lodge. Personal name. So it means the twin, son, district, nation, the twin nation. Talks about duality again. James Mason. James from Jacob. He grasps the heel. He is a supplanter. Probably in many cases something like Matheson, like son of Matthew. Hebrew. Gift of Jehovah. Gift of God. Jehovah is the provider, the gift of the descendants of Jacob. Israel was blessed through the United States. Divine providence that he would use to bless Israel. Maybe it was all preordained. Like they had a plan or something. Is that nuts? Then, fifth, James Monroe. That's Jacob. Grabs the heel, supplanter. I don't know, if you're grabbing your heel, you're bending over. I'd be concerned. Monroe, from the mouth of Roe. Marilyn Monroe dies in 1962, wins the Golden Globe for Some Like It Hot. Roe was a river in Ireland. The mouth of Roe would overthrow, supplant. Jane Roe was a plaintiff in Roe versus Wade. She later changed her position and became a staunch defender, pro-life position. It's remarkable, from the mouth of Roe. United States began to sacrifice more babies than any other country anywhere on this planet. Way more than Mellish. So from the mouth of one who would later realize her position resulted in the legalization of child sacrifice, was a result of deception. So from the mouth of Roe, America was done. 6. Already, we're only at 6, and you got 44, but it was screwed even by his name. 6. John Quincy Adams. John, God is glorious, has shown favor. Quincy, also an ordinary American citizen. John Q. Public, taken from John Quincy Adams. Right? Adams, man from earth. Grace in this land. No other country in the history of mankind has been afforded as much freedom and rights to so many. There are a couple times in here this could have worked. It could have. Advancements in technology, even world aid, was unprecedented. Despite America's failings, its rampant depravity, it's being built on blood, it had a chance. But once supplanted, the decline has been accelerating. Keep in mind, impoverished single women who give birth to children with no form of income receive income from the government. Individuals who grow up in poverty can achieve massive wealth, a concept never to have existed in previous civilizations. And despite income disparities, you must view this in relation to any other civilization and the bar of the world that is not perfect. Next, 7. Andrew Jackson. Manly. Jackson, son of Jack. Jack. Jake. Joachim. English has always looked at it as a form of John, I guess. But putting it together, Jackie. Those who God have shown favor, noble, brave, curious. The land of the brave. Well, not a big fan of Andrew Jackson, what he did to the native people again. But next, right after him, Martin Van Buren. Martin, of Mars, god of war, warlike, famous bear. Then we have, Martin Luther King. Van, Dutch, of or from, bear in a small island or a small town on an island north of the Netherlands. The war comes from a small island. Think civil war, race war, a small match can set an entire forest on fire. Ferguson is a microcosm. The famous bear, who shares the name with this president, is a noble and the most notable figure connected with relations in the United States, America's history. If you research the growing movements, and you got two sides of it, the Panthers and the KKK, they are both awaiting the first shot. It's only a matter of time now. Could go either way. But think spiritually too. The war that rages now, a small seed of rebellion begins the turning away, ultimately ends in calamity. The war shall begin small. 9. William Henry Harrison. William, protector. Will, helmet. Henry, rules the household. Harrison, son of Harry. Harry, home or house ruler. One may rule or protect his household, but the son of the house ruler is resolute. House ruler protects the household, basically. Number 10, John Taylor. John, God is glorious, has shown favor. Tailor, one who makes tiles. A tile is a flat, thin slab of fired clay, rubber, linoleum, etc. Usually a square, rectangle, sometimes ornamental, used with others to cover a roof or a wall or floor. We are all tile makers. Contribute small squares to the tapestry of creation. By God's gracious favor, you've been called to contribute in the tapestry. I know that one's stretching it a little bit. Johns K. Polk. James. He grasps the heel. He's bending over. Again. Knox. That's the K. Small. Hill. Polk. Reduced from the form Polak, German, of Slavic origin. From an altered pet form of Slavic personal name. Bolskov. Comprised of elements of bowl, great, large, or glory. So from the ascension out of a small hill came great glory. Think of the U.S. succeeding from the British Empire. Think of Bunker Hill. Think of the fact that they never really did. But, it's close. Now 12. Zachary Taylor. Hebrew, the meaning of Zachary is remembered by God. Tailor means, tailor. Right? Latin tailor, a cutter, or one who cuts. Remembered by God, he who cuts off. But Jesus, a fast 2 hours. I'll continue Thursday. Have a nice week, everybody, and talk to you soon. Bye for now.